So welcome everyone to Intro to Neurodiversity. This is the first in a 4-part series of DEI Lunch and Learns, and we're really fortunate today to have Dr. Diana Parry-Cruwys and Dr. Jason Clemence facilitating for us today and for the rest of the series. What I've done, as you can see, is started a recording. We're going to record this entire session today, and we'll post that to the Center for Inclusive Excellence's YouTube page, so you'll be able to find it there after, but I'll also email it to everyone who came here today. So thank you to Dr. Parry-Cruwys, Dr. Clemence. We really appreciate your time today, and I'll turn it over to you both.
All right, hello. Hi, everybody. Welcome. So happy to have you all here. And let me make this work. I'm bad at doing multiple things at once, to be quite honest with you. So I think I got it now for us. And thank you again for coming. So Jason and I are going to kind of tag team and trade off on this in a unprearranged fashion. So anytime we might either one of us jump in, and thank you again. Today is the first part of our series. So we are planned 4 different talks for you or anybody who wants to come. And they're all centering around neurodiversity, ways in which we as faculty and staff here at Regis can best support neurodivergent students. So for our session today, we really intended this to be mostly an introductory discussion. And the focus is really on defining neurodiversity terms, talking about neurodivergent perspectives, strengths, challenges, and then leaving some time at the end to get feedback from y'all on what questions you might have and or observations that you may have that can help us really identify what this group wants to discuss and help us to plan for the lunch and learns in the future, so we cover the topics that you want to hear about. So that's the plan for today. And here's who we are. Jason, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I think I know most of you, or even all of you, but I am in the humanities department. I teach English and film studies and writing primarily. I'm currently chair of humanities, and my work often discusses the idea or the sort of presence of anxieties in characters or in sort of cultural moods. I wouldn't say that it's my, #1 lens through which I read literature and film, but anxieties surrounding either sort of cultural developments or what a character, sort of an existential, what a character sees as being their core identity and how that's at odds with the world, right? I bring a lot of Sigmund Freud into my reading, so I have a very kind of an interest in what 100 years ago would have been called neurosis, and that what we now have, far more precise and clinical terms for. So that's in, and also I've had a fair number of experiences with neurodivergent students in all kinds of ways and in all sorts of notable moments, including some what we might call incidents. But we'll get into kind of talking about some ways to best be able to help students who might be neurodivergent in the classroom. And for my part, I also have a immense personal connection to this topic. My older son has ADHD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and is on the spectrum. And I myself have ADHD and obsessive compulsive disorder, and I'm on the spectrum. So there's apparently a genetic aspect to it. And so in both professional and personal contexts, it is something that I think about and try to learn more about as much as possible.
Awesome. Thank you, Jason. And I am Diana Parry-Cruwys, and I've been here at Regis for, I think, 5 or 6 years now, and I'm in the Applied Behavior Analysis department. So my professional background is working with individuals who are diagnosed on the spectrum. My area of expertise is really working with very, very young autistic learners, but I have spent lots and lots of time with many different neurodivergent individuals, and a lot of my research focus is on this aspect of neurodiversity. So was at the spring faculty development workshop, I believe, when we had John Robeson. Got that right? Okay, great. So when we had John Robeson come and talk to the group, I think that was a great moment for everyone to start to think about, or maybe I think everyone's already thinking about this component here, but how to, from there, translate some of the points that he was making into how can we best serve the students that we may work with. And it produced, I think, additional questions about what neurodiversity might be, where we might see it, whether we know if we might see it, and how that may impact some of our classroom and teaching arrangements. So we in the ABA department had some faculty reach out to us to kind of say, like, I want to know some more about this. And so that was part of the impetus for doing this neurodiversity series that we're finding ourselves in right now. So I thought it would make sense for us to start these conversations off with a general definition of neurodiversity. And I actually have a little video. It's only about 3 minutes long. And if it's okay with everyone, I thought we could flip over and watch that first, because the speaker in the video does a nice job giving us kind of a quick rundown of neurodiversity. So let me just, locate that on my screen. Oh, where did I put it? Here it is. Okay. We've been doing this for how long, right? How long have we been trying to make things work on Zoom? Long time. Share sound. I think I got it. All right, so we'll listen to her give us her definition of neurodiversity. This is a little Now This clip. And then after that, we can kind of break that down.
So Diana, we cannot hear it.
Can't hear it.
No.
Let me try that again.
We can hear it, but it's very, very low. Maybe just adjust the volume.
Okay.
Or if you share your computer sound,
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
important.
that typically
I
works.
did. There, now it's on. I think it wasn't clicked before. All right. One more time.
Neurological differences like autism or ADHD are considered to be dysfunctional disorders and disabilities under the medical model of mental health. There's too little attention given to enabling people with neurologically different minds to be accepted for themselves, to discover and celebrate their strengths, and to find a place in society that values their differences. When most of us think of diversity, we think of things like race or sexual orientation, but there's a different kind of diversity you might not know about: neurodiversity. Neurodiversity is the concept that neurological differences among people should be recognized and respected. I believe it's time for this new social movement, the neurodiversity movement, to take off. Neurodiversity is a part of our genetics and of our evolution as a species. The genes for autism and ADHD are not errors, but rather are the result of variations in the human genome that have and will continue to have advantages for society. One of the genes associated with ADHD, the DRD4 gene, is known as the novelty-seeking gene. It arrived on the human evolutionary scene over 10,000 years ago. Genes associated with autism also go back more than 10,000 years. Research suggests that genetic variants linked to autism might have been positively selected during human evolution because they contributed to exceptional memory skills, heightened perception in vision, taste, and smell, a precise eye for detail, and an enhanced understanding of systems such as animal behavior. These characteristics likely remain in the gene pool today because they are still advantageous. As a psychologist advising the parents of differently wired kids, I tell parents they have a choice between trying to change the child to fit the environment and changing the environment to fit the child. There are many different microhabitats and subcultures in our world. For an individual with autism or ADHD, finding success on their own terms may come from discovering the particular niche that fits best, the niche that allows their strengths to shine and their challenges to be minimized. Individuals with ADHD tend to thrive in situations of rapid change, variety, and that reward creativity and out-of-the-box thinking. A career as a comedian, detective, entrepreneur, journalist, actor, EMT technician, or photographer could be. I'm not saying that having autism or ADHD is easy. And I don't mean to downplay the real suffering that can be caused by having a neurodevelopmental condition, disability, or difference. But it's also time the world sees the beauty and value in brain differences. Neurodiversity might be every bit as crucial for the human race as biodiversity is for life in general. My vision is for a neurodiversity tolerant and accepting society where differences are celebrated for the depth and dimension they bring to the human condition. I want children whose brains are wired differently to be encouraged to find their niche instead of changing to fit other people's ideas of normal. Diversity in every sense makes our world a better place, and people who think differently are a huge part of that.
Where we were. So again, that was nice and short and sweet, and it gave us a quick little rundown. So her main point certainly was that we have a variety of brains and operation within our human condition, and that's not dissimilar at all to the biodiversity that we see throughout our natural settings. So it's makes sense that we might have differently wired brains as part of the human spectrum, and that those have been around for a long, long time, and that there are many ways in which they may be evolutionarily prepared and advantageous as well. These types of variations could be resulting from different neural pathways, strengthened pathways, right? Different neural connections, different brain structures, brain chemistry. And there appears to be a very large, as Jason said, genetic component as well, to whether you might see neurodivergence within particular family lines. So all of this is just to give us a background and a definition for what neurodiversity is when we hear that term. But there's actually several different terms that come into play here. And, you know, I also just want to say, like, I'm not an expert in these things. I've read about them, right? But it's something that I want everyone to have the same type of background in. That's why I'm bringing this information to you. And each of us can only come from our own perspective of lived experience. So it's important that we bring in lots of different voices to talk about these topics so that we are getting a variety of background. And you'll hear me and Jason say that again and again, right? Like, we need to look to people who have a variety of backgrounds and experience so we can see what their perspective is, what their lived experience is, learn from that and incorporate it into our own practices. So I've introduced this term of neurodiversity, but there's some other terms that kind of float around related to this. And I have 4 of them up here on the screen. So we have neurodiversity. We also have the term neurodiverse. And we have the term neurodivergent, which all sound like they're going to be the same thing, but you kind of use them in slightly different contexts. So, you know, being academics, I assume everyone wants to know all that good background stuff. And then we also have the term neurotypical. And I think a useful way to think about this is on the level at which these terms usually are applied. So when we say neurodiversity, that's when we already learned about. The idea of neurodiversity is it's a neural variation operating on the population level. So we have we have neurodiversity within our human population because we have lots of different types of brains. Now we also can have a group of people. Let's say we've identified a group of people. And if the people within that group have differently wired brains, then we would say that that group of people is a neurodiverse group. So everyone in the group's not the same, right? Brains are different, neurodiverse. And then at the individual level, we could have an individual who is either neurodivergent or what's also termed neurotypical. So a neurotypical person would be a brain that doesn't appear to be different from the quote unquote normal, right? So If we think about the largest percentage of the population, how their brain seems to be organized, how their social interactions seem to be organized, the things that they generally find to be likable and comfortable, and the way in which the world works for them, that group is termed neurotypical. And if someone doesn't feel like they fit into those categorizations, or someone else observes them and says that they don't fit into that, then that person would be categorized as neurodivergent. And there are lots and lots of different ways to be neurodivergent. How am I doing?
Great.
Okay. You guys just let me know. So I've included here for us, thanks, Becky. I've included here for us just one example that you can find on the internet. You can see down here on the bottom where I grabbed this one from, of what's termed the neurodivergent umbrella. So there are lots and lots of different ways that brains can operate outside of that norm, right? And there are so many different things included underneath this umbrella right here, right? So I'm including this for us all to take a look at because it is a little bit overwhelming. And I want to produce that idea for us to think about right now. Excuse me. The maybe a good thing to think about too, and maybe I should have said this before, is that the term neurodivergent or neurodivergence or neurodiversity is not one that you will necessarily find in the DSM. It is a term that was coined and intended to represent this way of thinking about our brain organization. But some of the things that are listed underneath here, you might find corresponding diagnoses for, and some other ones might be things that are more likely to be self-identified by folks who feel like they, the way in which they perceive and experience the world is different from other people. You don't have to raise your hand.
Well, I don't want to interrupt.
Go for it.
Well, I was just going to point out, and by the way, every time that I do speak up in these is going to be, be treading as carefully as possible, because my understanding of these things is much more at the layman's level and is much more has to do with my personal experiences, both personal and private, as opposed to knowing, the more sort of clinical or scholarly terminology. But I think an interesting thing to note with this, and it was something we talked about in one of our meetings leading up to this, is that I, up until this point, always thought of neurodivergence as naming things that you were essentially born with, that this is just how my brain chemistry is. So for instance, ADHD and being on the spectrum, I mean, I know that that's just been wired into my and my son's DNA from very early on, and I think that's the popular understanding. But I think some of these, as we can point out, even we just sort of inherently know are not things that you are neurologically born with, right? So PTSD would be a really good example, right? Like PTSD, I think, is always tied to a specific trauma event. And so there's a particular moment at which that takes hold. But obsessive compulsive disorder, the third thing in my triad as well, because I don't think that I was born with obsessive compulsive disorder. I think I developed obsessive compulsive disorder to cope with, or as a defense mechanism, and you can let me know if this is like supported by the literature, to cope with or have a sort of defense mechanism in the face of trying to deal with ADHD in a world that in the mid to late 80s wasn't particularly helpful or supportive of kids with ADHD. So I suspect that that's where my OCD came from. And again, I don't know if that's supported by the literature, but that's kind of my understanding of it. So I guess I'm just saying is a lot of people, I think of neurodivergence as just being autism or other things that are hardwired from birth. And as this graphic shows, that's not always the case.
Yeah, really, really great point to bring up. And if you look at different versions of this umbrella, different things will be listed underneath too. So that it's nothing hard and fast. And when I was presenting this to another group, we did have that discussion, like, what about this? What about this, right? And it's a term that's been developed by the community itself. So, you know, different people have different perspectives on what would necessarily fall underneath that umbrella. And I think that that's okay. But that's a really good point, is some of these PTSD, and then ABI over here stands for acquired brain injury as well. So that would be
Acquired, there you go.
yeah, so that would be something that would come later in life. Some of all the ones that say PD are different various personality disorders. And we're obviously not going to talk about all of these in detail here today, or in this series. Oh, look at that. Look at this, guys. Appreciate it. Okay, there we go. We got animations and everything. But these three are the ones that most often, when we think about neurodivergence, these are the ones that usually come up as being the largest percentages of the population that identifies as neurodivergent. And I circled dyslexia, but it's several of these learning difficulties. Dyslexia is difficulty reading, dyspraxia is difficulty speaking, dysgraphia is difficulty writing, and dyscalculia is difficulty with numbers in place of letters. So I circled one of those, but all of those might be represented, and those might all be areas in which you, as a staff or as a faculty, might see students who are having potential challenges in the classroom or in the college setting. So that's why I sort of circled those for us to look at. Is there anything else I want to say? Oh yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that those that you just mentioned, dyspraxia, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, I think those are really instructive for thinking about how so many neurodivergent things are, as we know, a spectrum, right? It's like, at what point does at what point does the sort of, struggle or challenge that we're observing go from math is hard, so,
Yeah.
like many of us probably experienced in school, to dyscalculia, right? I mean, surely there must be some sort of criterion for dividing dyscalculia per se from math is difficult for me, right? I mean, I think that really points to I don't think it's a fine line. I imagine it's part of the spectrum, but it's, I think, very instructive as far as why we talk about it as a spectrum.
Yeah, great point. So if you're wondering about, percentages of populations, these are the numbers from the NIH. And so these are relatively current, and it's always a little tricky to get exact numbers, but the estimations are about 1 in 7 people could be considered neurodivergent or identify as neurodivergent. So that's about 15 to 20% of the population. I did the math for you. And that breakdown further would be about 10% of that group. 10% of the general group might have dyslexia or some other learning difficulty, about 5% ADHD, and then maybe 1 to 2% ASD or autism. But again, these numbers can vary a good bit. The number of individuals diagnosed with autism, I can tell you that, has steadily increased over the years. So the most current numbers are at about 1 in 44. So those would be, young children who are currently receiving those diagnoses. So we could expect to continue to see the number of individuals who are diagnosed as autistic rise as that group ages and enters into the college years. So like I said, someone who's neurodivergent, you definitely do, or you might yourself be neurodivergent too. Sometimes people wonder about this type of question. So is neurodivergence having a differently wired brain? Should we think of that as a disability? We're going to talk a lot more about disability if you hopefully join us next week. So we won't get totally into the weeds on it here today, but let me first state that no, just having a differently wired brain is not automatically a disability. It's a difference. And there's a difference between a difference and disability. On the sort of the same note, nor is it an intellectual disability to have a neurodivergent brain. Sometimes we see co-occurrence between intellectual disability and some of these diagnoses that we just discussed, but most certainly not always. So we should not expect that those come part and parcel. Now, to give you a sort of a taste of what we're going to talk about next week, there are times in which being neurodivergent can come to function as a disability when there is a disconnect between how that person experiences the world and how that world experiences the person, basically. So if you are operating or attempting to operate in a world that's really not designed for you because you're part of a minority, or that world doesn't take into account and consideration the needs that you may have in order to operate successfully in that world, then there may be some disconnect there that functions as a disability. But we'll talk more about that next week, as I said, hopefully in detail. So I just want to present that now. It's not in and of itself a disability, but having that difference in how you experience the world can make things more challenging. And one of the main points of this whole series is that we talk about how we can accommodate and lessen those challenges that people may experience who are neurodivergent. So I wanted to, let me see how we're doing. We're doing okay, time-wise. So I wanted us to sort of think about neurodivergent perspectives, and I added this quote here, which is the perspective of the disability rights movement, which says, "Nothing about us without us." So I, once again want to reiterate that, my perspective is only my perspective, and I cannot speak for folks who have certain diagnoses that I don't have. So I don't want to do that. I just want to bring information that I can to you as a group so that we can better educate ourselves and recognize that what we need to be doing is turning to individuals who do identify as neurodivergent in different ways so we can hear their perspective and understand, right? So I don't want to be speaking for anyone here, but I do want to make sure that we've given us some information about what it may be like to be neurodivergent in different ways. Now I grabbed this graphic from the Little Penguin Studios. I love these penguin guys, but I don't know if you've seen this floating around on the internet before, but it's talking specifically about autism, and it's presenting to us the idea that autism is not a spectrum in the sense of some people have quote unquote more autism and some people have less autism, right? So these little penguins are saying, am I quote unquote very autistic? Am I a little bit autistic? No, that's really not how this operates. And this, I think this same idea will really hold true across different neurodivergent perspectives that we may be discussing in the future. So rather than thinking of it as a spectrum as, oh, this person is only a little bit quote unquote affected by their autism, but rather thinking of it as a spectrum in the sense that everyone has different strengths and differences, right? Different strengths and difficulties. And so the bottom perspective here, we have a little pinwheel that has all these different areas in which someone may have difficulties, or this area may really function as a strength for them, independent of their diagnosis. And so these areas listed here are common areas that you hear people say, oh, this is something that is maybe challenging for an autistic person, but it doesn't always have to be. So social skills, communication, repetitive behavior, executive functioning skills, interests, perceptions, and sensitivities. And the graphic here is suggesting everybody is different and we all look different in sort of our makeup of things that are strengths for us or challenges for us, but it's not a linear spectrum arrangement. Rather, you got to get to know every single person to find out what is easy for them, hard for them, an area of strength for them, etc. Some of you might be wondering if you have neurodivergent students in your class, and
You do.
you do, yes, exactly, you do. But the other important takeaway I think here is that you don't have to know if a student is neurodivergent, right? It's it's not as though, oh, because I know that this student has this diagnosis, I'm going to now treat them in this particular way. Every case is just a case by case basis. And you're going to see what that student needs. You're going to try your best to accommodate the class as a whole. And then if there are additional needs or considerations, then you're going to, meet that student where they're at, and if appropriate, also work with the Office of Accessibility Services too. So like Jason said, you won't always know if you have neurodivergent students in your class, but you should expect that you do have neurodivergent students in your class. And we do not need any type of disclosure of a diagnosis in order to best support students. Another piece to know is not everyone has a formal diagnosis, because diagnosis is a very lengthy and expensive process. And while in this type of setting here in colleges, we might be more likely to have students who have gone through that process in order to access accommodations, not everyone has done that. And all that really means is that we should just do our best to make sure whatever accommodations someone might need, we are trying our best to provide those in the general arrangement of our classrooms, which again, we'll discuss more down the road in the future. It's also not uncommon as well that students may have received a diagnosis in the past, but they or their parents haven't really acted on fully accessing those accommodations related to it.
Yeah, a lot of parents, I think, are interested in getting the testing or the intervention done, and then sort of like, I think that probably they're, in this case, maybe they're really hoping that it's not neurodivergence or spectrum or whatever, and then when they get the result that it likely is, I think there's a tendency to go into kind of like a denial mode, right? Like, well, that's not the answer I was looking for, or just to kind of think that like this, oh, maybe this is going to lead to my kid being ostracized, so I'm going to just pretend it didn't exist. I've come to learn that that's more common than you might think, even for parents who seek out that treatment or diagnosis, that their hope is that it'll be ruled out, and if it's not ruled out, they kind of maybe don't take the news or be proactive with it in a way that one might hope.
Yeah. So you could have students who are sort of anywhere along that entire path, right, in your class, or others who may not have a diagnosis, may have not self-diagnosed as well, but who still potentially need have some support needs too. And then students may self-disclose at varying points during the semester as well. Again, it's not required for us to respond compassionately to know someone's diagnosis, but it's always possible that they might disclose at different points in time. Now, the other thing that Jason and I wanted to make sure we discussed is the potential stereotypes that might surround neurodivergent students or particular diagnoses, and speak to those a little bit. And I've really focused here on autism and ADHD because I think that those are two that we are likely to see fairly often in the classroom. And again, they're largely representative of the neurodivergent populations that often we encounter. So what we've kind of tried to lay out here are some both strengths and challenges that you may see in an autism profile, but I cannot stress enough that everyone is different, just like our little penguins on the previous slides. It is truly the case, and I know hundreds of autistic people, that everyone is really different. So what's listed here might be areas in which you sort of have a stereotypical profile of what an autistic person might look like, and every person you meet, you might say, okay, well, that seems to kind of match up with what their presentation looks like, but in other ways, they're completely and utterly different from my expectation. So the important part is to go in basically with no expectations, but it's always possible that some of your students who identify or diagnose as autistic have some of the challenges that are listed here. These are challenges that are, really integral to receiving the diagnosis itself. So communication and social interaction challenges, difficulties with disruption in routine, sensory sensitivity. So that could be lights, sounds, clothing, general just overwhelm, environmental overwhelm, and then executive functioning challenges. But I don't want us at all to overlook the strengths that are, again, it's individualized, but are often associated with this profile too. So, many folks I know are very detail oriented, have excellent memories, often very honest and logical, have such a unique perspective and bring a lot of new and different types of ideas and ways of thinking to problem solving, very observant and passionate and creative too. So someone could, any one of these pieces could sort of match up with them, and others might not match with them at all. But I want us to, dispel maybe stereotypes that you might see in the little video that we watched, right? Like many of those clips that she pulled are from, or maybe not many of them, but some of them I recognize as The Good Doctor. And I think she had an Atypical one. If either of you have seen those shows, those are pretty stereotypical presentations of autistic individuals. So I think we want to dispel those myths that that's exactly what our students might be like. Students can be so many, many, many different ways. And autistic girls as well. We also don't want to leave out that population that often goes undiagnosed too. So this is, again, I'm like putting it up here and telling you it might not be like this at all. And then the same for ADHD too. You might see students who have challenges in time management or executive functioning, organization skills. Again, some differences in communication and interests that may kind of ebb and flow. And you might see large periods of productivity and then other periods where assignments are late or not turned in, et cetera. But it's going to be different for everybody. And we also want to focus on strengths of many folks within this profile too, which again are passionate and creative, lots and lots of different interests. Periods of hyper focus can often be very, very productive. And I know a lot of folks with this ADHD as well who are very imaginative too. So this is something for us to think about, but not to rely on when we're attempting to understand our students who might be neurodivergent. You good, Jason?
Yep.
Okay. Great.
Oh, wait, you know what? So could we go back to the student thing for a second? Because
Yeah.
I was just going to bring up there, and I guess maybe this is going to lead into the discussion or Q&A, but just how, in my experience, and I bet a lot of other faculty members have this experience of having a student in a large class who seems at times to dominate the conversation or to bring the conversation into, while kind of being the one who's consistently raising their hand, to kind of take it into places that obviously we encourage making connections and, bringing in sort of, supplementary ideas, but often bringing the conversation to something totally unrelated, or only maybe not in their mind, but or tangentially related, or just personal of interest to them. And what I've always found happens, I can think of 3 or 4 distinct examples of this in the last few years, is there becomes this slowly growing, usually hits sort of the tipping point or critical mass by like midterm or so, of the rest of the class almost being unified in their sort of maybe like condescension or annoyance at that student. And of course, one of the main understandings we have of being on the spectrum is that the student, maybe blessedly, doesn't necessarily realize that they become this object of ostracization. But from my position in the front of the room, it's so clear, but it always feels like there's no good way to handle it, that wouldn't be shaming or embarrassing for somebody, right in the room. But it's such an awful thing to know that a student who's trying very earnestly to participate is being looked down on by their peers. And I've said this before, but I really feel like it's the last frontier in terms of acceptance. Students in the classroom who wouldn't dream of mocking somebody for their sexuality or ethnicity or anything like that, or
Physical
personal
disability.
right? Oh yeah, physical disability or just personal appearance or whatever else will still kind of participate in this sense of you know, kind of annoyance or condescension. And I think it's because it presents as a, well, this is just a person who's self-absorbed, right? Like we kind of put a simpler negative trait on it, even though a lot of students know that it's the result of neurodiversity. I once had a student write in a course evaluation, and I knew exactly who he was talking about, that students who dominate the conversation or unnecessarily take up time, like basically this student was telling me that I shouldn't indulge that, like that I should, I guess the idea being just don't call on him so much, or well, sometimes he's the only one who raises his hand, you know, or something like that. But it even said right in that comment, even if it is because of a legitimate disability. So the student who wrote that in the evaluation knew perfectly well that this was a clinical example of neurodiversity, but still wanted to tell me like, well, don't play into that, you know, keep them quiet, basically. I mean, so yeah, I really think it's the last frontier in acceptance in this generation, which, you know, overall, the generation of college students that we teach right now, I think are like the best people ever as far as their open-mindedness and sense of acceptance, but there's still this particular sticking point for a lot of people.
Yeah. That is a great point, and I bet a lot of people have stories and similarities that they've seen in their populations of students too, where that's such a challenge. And I think, you know, we're all like coming from our own perspective. So it's like, if I could understand that this is, you know, beyond the pale level of discussion on this topic, why can't this other person see that too? So it's a matter of like, we can have a really hard time, I think, taking that perspective of someone else. And it's easier for us if they are sort of like-minded, right? If I can do that much more easily for someone else who is neurotypical. And it's harder for me with someone who's neurodivergent, but I've also heard that for other neurodivergent folks, it's much easier for them to take the perspective of someone who's neurodivergent than neurotypical. So it's like a split there. And to me, one of the important takeaways here is that your student who presented that comment, right? They were, you know, really focused on their own perspective too. And I feel like the old mindset is, well, we need to change that neurodivergent student's behavior. And it is true that we need to share the classroom space. But to me, what stands out in that example is that we need to change the perspectives of the neurotypical students in the class. And that's what you're saying. It's the last frontier as far as our own navel gazing, I guess, right?
Should we open up to Q&A and discussion?
I think probably, because it's about that time, isn't it? Yeah, sounds good. Let me just say this last slide. And then we will. I do want to just mention some of these intersections that you might see in identity. So it's not uncommon for autism and ADHD to be co-occurring or co-diagnosed. Estimated maybe 50 to 60% of autistic individuals also have an ADHD components. I'm not going to say diagnosis for the college age students, because only in 2015 were you allowed to receive both of these diagnoses together. So that group may have missed that cutoff. But as folks age, and then mental health is a really big concern for neurodivergent individuals. And so both of these two groups have higher rates of anxiety and depression than the general population, quite a bit higher, as you can see here, maybe 5 times as high. So that's something important to know about and think about as far as these conversations go, that there may be even more to understand, and that may be being presented at the same time. And then finally, just as a point of reference for everyone too, throughout different surveys, neurodivergent individuals are much more likely to identify as LGBTQ+ as well. So, you know, I know like younger generations, these numbers are increasing across the board, independent of neurodivergent or neurotypical affiliation, I guess. But for the older folks, 15 to 30% is a high percentage in comparison to the general population. So that is another important thing to take into consideration as well. All right, let's move ourselves on. We're going to have all these slides available for you. But I know that there are lots of comments in the chat and I haven't been able to look, but maybe we can look through some of those now. And then if anyone wants to open up, you know, we are recording this, so I wouldn't want anyone to say anything that they didn't want to have recorded or that was, you know, personal or identifying about any of your students. But if you have experiences that you want to share, or if you have questions that you want to present to us that either maybe we answer today or we save for a future lunch and learn, we would be more than happy to hear those.
I have a question or a comment, or I don't know if it's a question or a comment.
Sure.
I think it's a question. You know, I'm a little torn about some of this in that, given how prevalent these ways of thinking are among our population and among the students that we're teaching, I do sometimes wonder whether the accommodations are serving them or serving us, and if we shouldn't be thinking more in more general terms about how, you know, our teaching styles, our assignments can become more humane, flexible, so that one student might deal with the assignment differently than another student, for example. I guess that's that idea of the universal design. But rather than thinking, oh, this student or this way of thinking requires something drastically different, some of the accommodations sometimes, like I'll talk to the students individually who might have an accommodation, and they don't always match what they need. Do you know what I mean? Like, oh, they need to take their test in a different room. And then I talk to them and say, well, we're going to have a lot of quizzes. We're going to have a lot of just free write kinds of quizzes. Are you okay with that? Or how do you want to deal with that? And they don't want to leave the classroom at all. They're like, no, I can do that. Or the longer time for an assignment. Sometimes if you're already giving an assignment with some concern for the other work that everyone is doing, do I really need to give a longer time for this one? You know, they may not need that. My own daughter had ADD, and she said, why would I want a longer time to do this assignment? I want to be out of my misery as soon as possible. You know, like, why would I want that? So, you know, I went through great lengths to get a diagnosis for her before she went to college so that she could get accommodations, and she never went to get them. She didn't want them. So there's that comment. Then the other question I have is whether you guys know if the diagnoses are higher among white students than among minority students, simply because of the economic burden of getting a diagnosis. Do you think that it's possible? Because sometimes I feel that, you know, our accommodations kind of break down in this socioeconomic way that makes me very uncomfortable, where I see a student of color who's struggling, and I think, I wonder if that's a student who just never got any kind of diagnosis, but they seem to be following the same pattern of not being able to remember to hand something in, or not, you know, whatever it is, right? And I know, you know, legally they don't have accommodations, so I have to hold them to this deadline. But I see a lot of social inequity in all of this too that worries me. And I think here at Regis, that might be something that we'd want to sort of take up as a concern. I don't know how we would help students in that way, but I know that we were able to afford it, but I couldn't get my daughter. We had to pay for a private diagnosis, mainly because she wasn't a troublemaker in the classroom. So the counselor at school said, well, she hands assignments in late. That's not really a behavior problem. So we really can't help you. Like, okay, thanks. So, and it was pricey.
Yes.
And then she didn't use it. So, so anyway, there's 2 comment questions. I don't know what you want to do with those. So I'll stop now.
Okay. To your first point, yes, I agree. Accommodations don't always match, but I think we can see what is beneficial for the student. And then the second part, again, my area is more knowing about autism. So autism, as far as its prevalence, does not appear to vary based on race, nationality, etc. But it is true that access to diagnosis is particularly arduous process and can be very expensive and time consuming. So those factors could definitely play in to who actually gets through all of those, unnecessarily hard hurdles to reach actually getting diagnosis and accommodations.
And not even
think-
just the pure expense of doing and I think that getting a spectrum disorder or autism test is even more arduous than ADHD, in my experience. But I feel like it's also not just the expense outright of the test, which to be clear about that, most recently, I know that doing a full 7-hour evaluation for autism runs between $2,500 and $3,000 out of pocket. But also just having the time and resources and know-how to even begin exploring that. I mean, it's hard to find, a good fit for a therapist, much less going into like these much more sort of detailed, discipline-specific diagnoses, both for children and adults. So, I mean, I think that the socioeconomic class thing isn't even just about the money to pay for the testing and then the treatment. It's also just about like having the bandwidth, as we often say, to even be able to get started on it, because it's not like there's just a number you call and, oh, you're all set up to do this now. Like it can take a lot of legwork.
Marie?
Hi, sorry for joining a little bit late.
No problem.
I don't know if you had addressed this earlier, or maybe this is something that we can, talk about in future ones, because there's 3 more, right, of these as well. So what about students who maybe don't know they're neurodivergent and are struggling in the classroom, or like how might we be able to support those students and they maybe not have accommodations or anything like that? I think like what is our role for them, and how can we help them and support them? I don't even know if my question made sense.
Yeah, so I can speak to my field. So in my field, we have a saying that is, the student is always right. So it's not the teacher is always right, it's the student is always right. So if my student is not learning, it's my job to figure out why and how I can help them. Now, we do have the luxury in my field of focusing very much on individualized education. So I'm able to make those changes and accommodations like relatively easily. But part of what we want to do within this series is look at what are some ways in which faculty can arrange their classrooms, their materials, and sort of their expectations so that we can provide as much accommodation ahead of any problems as possible. And some of these concerns you're mentioning will get caught by those accommodations, and some of them won't. And I don't want to pretend like they will.
Yeah. I think my follow-up question on that is, we do have, email correspondence and PDFs, right, from the disability office that students have, accommodations and stuff. And while we don't know exactly, what their condition is there maybe a way to, understand or know that maybe some particular students are neurodivergent, how we can better help them. I understand HIPAA and like diagnoses and all that, but is there a way maybe to like allude to that or anything? I'm a very new to this field too, so I do want to learn more about it. So yeah.
Yeah, HIPAA, yes, wise, we don't
Yeah.
get those disclosures. And I think that that's okay. I honestly, I just assume everyone's neurodivergent.
Okay,
Just, like
all
start
right.
from there.
I like that approach.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you.
There are great comments going on in the chat.
Yeah, I've
Um,
thrown a lot in the chat because I have
thank
a
you, Becky.
1:30 meeting.
No problem.
But I did want to say, I think, in the coming weeks, I think it really would be great to talk about, it's very difficult in the psych program. Sometimes you can see someone, you're like, oh, here are some signs of dyslexia, and it's still not a good idea, even if you think you see something, to point it out to a student. And so that is a key approach that I think we can learn how to do that skillfully, how to ask questions, how to get them to be metacognitive about, disability is always that interaction between the student and the environment. So if it's an executive functioning issue of how can I help you succeed in this class? And then it's always the two of you working together. And often that can lead to a student understanding themselves better. So anyway, I look forward to, I'm glad this was a series and not a one-off. I'm really particularly glad of that.
Thanks. Yes, I hope to cover some of those topics in the future too. Thanks, Becky. I just brought this back up here for a second so everyone can see the plan where we're going to meet here next week to continue this conversation related to disability and introduce the concept of ableism. And then we have two planned for March, which I think I know a lot of you have like procedural questions, like how do I actually do the things I want to do? I'm hoping that those two will focus on that. One that Diana Purdue and Erica Hollis are going to join us for, talk about universal design. And then another, we talk about creating inclusive classroom settings and the ways in which we can plan to support our neurodivergent learners. So hopefully you can join us for those as well. Any parting comments?
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate that just from the logistical side of it. Thank you. Thank you so much, Diana, Jason. We really appreciate your talk today. You should have the invites. This group should all have the invites already, but there will be a reminder email sent out, as well as a reminder when I send out the recording of this session as well. So you will have all of that.
Thank you. I will watch the recording. I was late.
Wonderful.
Right.
Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you again to our wonderful facilitators. We really appreciate it and all the time you're dedicating to this series. As Becky already said, we're all thankful. I think that this is a series and we're thankful for your time. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks, everyone. Diana and Jason, can you notate Julia's questions so we can make sure that we get that, or does someone have the chat so we can make sure that we all of those comments to be able to address them in the upcoming sessions in some way, shape, or form?
Yeah, let's definitely, I think, is there a way to get the chat log saved that you have to manually do that, or is that automatic? I can't call.
Christine, you're on mute.
Because it's recorded, it should be automatic for us.
That's what I thought. Yeah. Okay, great. And that's funny that, Erica, that you specifically mentioned Julia's comment, because I was actually going to text Julia my thoughts on that right afterward. But if there's widespread consensus that that's something, Julia, I think you're right completely. I feel as those students who kind of react in a visibly irritated way with neurodivergent students, I feel like they think that they're supporting the professor, like they think they're supporting me somehow, right? Like as though like, yeah, I think they're trying to like be on my side, even though I'm trying very hard to not turn it into a sides thing. But yeah, I agree with you totally.
Yeah, I think it's partly that. I think that they do pick up on our distress, though,
Yeah,
because I think we do display that we're anxious for the rest of the class when we see things going off the rails a little bit.
Yeah.
So in that sense of they're supporting us, they're also trying to, they don't know how to enter into that. Suddenly there's this little tunnel of attention between the professor and that student, and they don't know what to do.
Yeah.
You know, and so I do think it's, you know, it's partly that.
The flip side of it is, though, it's sometimes those neurodivergent students who dominate the conversation and annoy the rest of the class are making the best insights of anybody in the room.
Sometimes I would agree that I've had many students who are like that, who thank God for them, because, you know, things would not move. But I've had the students who truly are struggling to know how to perform socially in that classroom.
Oh, absolutely.
It's so hard for the other students.
It's
on the positive side, I had one great student who, you know, they explained to the class what it felt like. It was a class about literature and the body. So